You don't belong here. The words cut through the gilded ballroom like a blade through silk. Every head turned. Every whisper stopped. Elena Thatcher stood frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers of Silverton House, her forged invitation trembling in the butler's gloved hand, held high like evidence at a trial. The cream of London society pressed closer, their diamond-adorned throats craning to witness her humiliation. This was the moment her desperate gamble would destroy her, or change everything. But what happened next? What he did? Would shake the foundations of Victorian high society and prove that sometimes the greatest scandal births the greatest love. Stay with us until the end to see how a penniless artist conquered an empire, and don't forget to hit that like button and comment which city you're watching from. The rain had stopped an hour before midnight, leaving London's cobblestones slick and gleaming under the gas lamps like scattered jewels. Elena Thatcher pressed herself against the iron fence bordering Mayfair's most exclusive square, watching carriages discharge their glittering cargo, women draped in silk and fur, men in pristine evening dress, all flowing toward the blazing windows of Silverton House like moths to an impossibly beautiful flame. Her fingers traced the edge of the invitation hidden in her cloak. The paper was perfect. She'd studied genuine invitations for weeks at the print shop where her friend Thomas worked. The calligraphy was flawless, copied stroke by stroke from a discarded sample she'd found in a rubbish bin behind the stationer's. The wax seal was slightly imperfect, but who would look that closely? You're truly mad, you know that? Elena turned to find Sarah Chen, her only friend besides Thomas, emerging from the shadows. Sarah worked as a seamstress in one of the great houses, and it was she who'd procured the gown Elena now wore, a cast-off from her employer's daughter, altered to fit Elena's slighter frame. Perhaps, Elena whispered, but I'm also desperate. Your aunt is dying. Elena's voice cracked. The doctors say she has months at best, and when she's gone, I'll have nothing. No income, no home, no prospects. You know what happens to women like us, Sarah. The workhouse if we're lucky, the streets if we're not. Sarah's dark eyes filled with sympathy. But this? Sneaking into the Silverton Ball, how does this help? Elena pulled out the small leather portfolio she'd brought. Inside were her finest botanical illustrations, delicate watercolors of rare orchids and exotic ferns, each petal and leaf rendered with scientific precision and artistic grace. Lady Silverton is a patroness of the arts. Everyone knows she supports young artists, especially women. If I can just get her to see my work, if she could just give me a commission or a recommendation, she'll have you arrested for fraud. Then I'll be arrested. Elena's jaw set with determination. But I have to try. I have to. Because doing nothing means watching Aunt Margaret die in a charity ward while I fade into invisibility myself. At least this way, I'll have tried, I'll have reached for something more. Sarah sighed and pulled Elena into a fierce embrace. Then go, be brilliant, be bold, and for heaven's sake, don't drink too much champagne. It goes straight to your head. Despite everything, Elena laughed. Then she straightened her shoulders, checked that her chestnut hair was still properly pinned beneath her borrowed hat, and stepped out of the shadows. The walk across the square felt like crossing a battlefield. Each step brought her closer to either triumph or ruin, and there was no turning back. The footman at the door barely glanced at her invitation before waving her through, and suddenly she was inside, swept up in a river of silk and jewels and expensive perfume. Silverton House was everything she'd imagined and more. The entrance hall soared 3 stories high, its walls covered in paintings worth more than Elena would earn in 10 lifetimes. A grand staircase curved upward like a wave of white marble, its balustrade adorned with flowers, real hothouse roses in December, an obscene display of wealth. The air shimmered with warmth and light, and music floating down from the ballroom above. Elena climbed the stairs carefully, hyper-aware of every detail. The way the other women moved with effortless grace, as if they'd been born in these spaces. The casual arrogance of the men, their voices carrying across the crowd without a care for who might overhear. The smell of beeswax candles and expensive tobacco, and something else. Something indefinable that marked the difference between those who belonged and those who didn't. The ballroom took her breath away. It stretched the entire length of the house, its ceiling painted with classical scenes of gods and goddesses, its walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the candlelight into infinity. At one end, an orchestra played a waltz. At the other, doors opened onto a terrace where couples strolled in the cold night air. And everywhere were people who represented everything Elena could never be: wealthy, connected, secure in their place in the world. "Champagne, miss." Elena took a glass from a passing footman with trembling fingers. She sipped it carefully, letting the bubbles settle her nerves. Now came the hard part, finding Lady Silverton without drawing too much attention to herself. She circled the room slowly, studying faces, listening to conversations. The gossip was delicious and terrible in equal measure. Who was courting whom? Which families faced financial ruin? Which marriages were shams? Elena committed it all to memory, both fascinated and repelled by this glimpse into a world she'd only read about in novels. "I haven't seen you before." Elena nearly dropped her glass. The woman who'd spoken was perhaps 40, beautiful in a severe way, her dark hair streaked with distinguished silver. Her gown was deep burgundy velvet, and diamonds glittered at her throat. Elena's mind raced. "I keep rather to myself usually." "How mysterious." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Lady Arabella Thornfield, and you are?" "Elena Thatcher." The truth seemed safer than a lie. "Thatcher." Lady Arabella's brow furrowed delicately. "I don't believe I know the family." "We're quite obscure," Elena said, which was perhaps the truest thing she'd ever said. "How delightful." Lady Arabella's tone suggested it was anything but. "And how do you know the Silvertons?" Before Elena could answer, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. The crowd parted, whispers rising like wind through wheat, and Elena saw him for the first time. Maximilian Rutherford, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood at the top of the stairs with the casual confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to exist. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and features that were more striking than handsome. A strong nose, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of steel. He wore his evening dress with the same ease other men wore their skin, and when he moved into the ballroom, it was as if the very air rearranged itself around him. "The Duke," Lady Arabella breathed, and something in her voice made Elena glance at her. The older woman's face had transformed, softened with something that looked almost like hunger. "Isn't he magnificent?" Elena didn't answer. She was too busy watching the Duke navigate the crowd, accepting greetings with a nod here, a word there, never quite stopping, never quite engaging. He looked, she thought, profoundly bored. "They say he must marry soon," Lady Arabella continued, seemingly talking to herself now. "The estate requires heirs, and the family name must continue. Every matchmaking mama in London has put forth her daughter, but he's refused them all. Too proud, some say, too particular. But I think he simply hasn't met the right woman yet, someone of appropriate rank and breeding, naturally. Someone who understands what it means to be a duchess." The way she said it made her meaning clear. Lady Arabella had designs on the Duke herself. Elena murmured something non-committal and excused herself, moving deeper into the crowd. She'd spotted Lady Silverton across the room, an elderly woman with kind eyes and elaborate white hair, holding court near the terrace doors. This was her chance. She'd made it halfway across the ballroom when disaster struck. "You there! Miss, stop!" The voice was loud enough to cut through the music. Elena froze, her heart plummeting into her stomach. She turned slowly to find the butler, a tall, thin man with the face of a hanging judge, striding toward her through the crowd. "Yes?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Your invitation, if you please." The music had stopped, or perhaps Elena could simply no longer hear it over the roaring in her ears. Every eye in the ballroom had turned to watch. She fumbled in her reticule, pulled out the forged invitation with fingers gone numb. The butler took it, examined it closely. His expression never changed, but something cold settled in his eyes. "This invitation," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "is a forgery." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. Elena heard gasps, whispers, the rustle of silk as people pressed closer to witness her disgrace. She tried to speak, but her throat had closed. "You are an impostor," the butler continued, relentless. You have gained entrance to this house under false pretenses. You have infiltrated decent society through deception and fraud. That's not... I only wanted... Elena's voice broke. She could feel tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The authorities will be summoned, the butler announced. You will be removed and charged appropriately. The crowd murmured its approval. Elena saw Lady Arabella in the front row of onlookers, her face alight with malicious satisfaction. She saw Lady Silverton shaking her head sadly. She saw footmen moving to block the exits. She'd gambled everything and lost. Worse than lost. She'd be arrested, imprisoned, branded as a criminal. Aunt Margaret would die alone and ashamed. Elena herself would be destroyed, her name synonymous with fraud and desperation. Wait! The voice cut through the chaos like a blade, quiet but absolute. The crowd parted, and the Duke of Ashbourne stepped forward. He looked at Elena with those steel-gray eyes, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Then he turned to the butler. This woman, he said clearly, is my guest. The silence that followed was total. Even the servants seemed to have stopped breathing. Your Grace, the butler's composure cracked, but the invitation is unnecessary. The Duke's voice never rose, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. I invited Miss Thatcher personally. The written invitation was merely a formality. Clearly there was some confusion in its preparation, but I assure you she is exactly where she is meant to be. Elena stared at him, unable to process what was happening. He was lying. He was lying for her, a stranger, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. The butler looked between them, clearly torn between duty and self-preservation. One didn't contradict a duke, not if one valued one's position. I see. My apologies, Your Grace. And to you, miss. He bowed stiffly and retreated, the forged invitation still clutched in his hand. The crowd didn't know how to react. Some looked scandalized, others intrigued. Lady Arabella's face had gone white with fury. The Duke turned to Elena and offered his arm. Shall we dance? It wasn't really a question. Elena placed her hand on his sleeve, feeling the fine wool of his jacket, the solid strength of the arm beneath. He led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra, reading the room perfectly, struck up a waltz. I don't understand, Elena whispered as he took her in his arms. His hand settled at her waist, warm even through the layers of silk and corset. Why would you... Later, he murmured. For now, just dance, and try to look as if you belong here. I don't belong here. We both know it. No? He guided her into the first turn with practiced ease. And yet here you are, dancing with the Duke. While everyone in this room watches and wonders, I'd say you belong here more than most of them. Elena looked up at him, trying to read his face. You're mocking me. I'm honestly not. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. I'm curious, actually. What possessed you to forge an invitation to the Silverton Ball? Poverty, ambition, revenge? None of those. Or perhaps all of them. Elena took a breath. I'm an artist, a botanical illustrator. I thought if I could just show my work to Lady Silverton, she might give me a commission. My aunt is dying and I have no prospects, and I was desperate enough to take a foolish risk. And instead you've created the scandal of the season. He spun her through a complex turn, and despite everything, Elena felt her body respond to the music, to the rhythm of the dance. Every newspaper in London will be discussing this tomorrow. Duke of Ashbourne claims mystery woman as guest. The betting books at White's will be filled with speculation about who you are and what you mean to me. Elena's stomach dropped. I've ruined you. On the contrary, you've made me interesting again. Now he definitely smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Do you know how unbearably dull my life has become? Every day the same round of obligations and expectations, every eligible woman in England paraded before me like horses at auction. Every conversation a calculated move in some tedious social chess game. And then you appear with your forged invitation and your botanical illustrations and your desperate courage, and suddenly the evening has possibilities again. You're mad, Elena said faintly. Possibly, or possibly I'm the only sane one here. The waltz was ending. He drew her closer for the final bars, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something with sandalwood and bergamot. What's your name? Your full name? Elena Thatcher. Well, Miss Elena Thatcher, I suggest you stay close to me for the remainder of the evening. My endorsement will protect you from the worst of the gossip, but only if you appear to be under my patronage. Can you do that? I don't have a choice, do I? Everyone has choices. You chose to come here tonight. You chose to risk everything for a chance at something better. That took remarkable courage, or remarkable foolishness, and I find myself wanting to discover which. The music ended. He released her but didn't step away. So what do you choose now? To stay and face them? Or to run and let them win? Elena lifted her chin. Around them, the ballroom hummed with speculation. Lady Arabella was watching with naked hostility. Lady Silverton looked thoughtful. 100 other faces registered shock, intrigue, disapproval, fascination. I'll stay, Elena said. Good. The Duke offered his arm again. Then let me introduce you properly. It's time London society learned your name. The next hour passed in a blur. The Duke, call me Maximilian, he'd said quietly, though she couldn't quite bring herself to do so, introduced her to what felt like every person in attendance. Each introduction was a small shock, watching faces transform as they realized this nobody, this fraud, was under ducal protection. Some were gracious, or at least polite. Others barely concealed their disdain. Lady Arabella, when they finally reached her, smiled with all her teeth and none of her eyes. How delightful to meet you properly, Miss Thatcher, she purred. And how extraordinary that you and His Grace are such close friends. I had no idea. When did you say you first became acquainted? It was a trap, expertly laid. Elena opened her mouth, unsure how to answer without deepening the lie. We met last spring, Maximilian said smoothly, at the Royal Botanic Gardens. Miss Thatcher was sketching specimens, and I was escaping a particularly tedious garden party. We struck up a conversation about orchids, and I valued her insights ever since. It was specific enough to be believable, vague enough to avoid contradiction. Lady Arabella's smile tightened. How charming! And yet you never mentioned her, Your Grace, not once in all our conversations about art and culture. I protect my friend's privacy, Maximilian replied, his tone cooling noticeably, particularly when I know how vicious society can be toward anyone perceived as different or inferior, as you've just demonstrated. The cut was delivered with surgical precision. Lady Arabella's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Maximilian had already guided Elena away. That was cruel, Elena murmured. That was necessary. Arabella is a shark. Show weakness, and she'll tear you apart. He glanced down at her. You're trembling. I'm terrified. Good. That means you're sane. He steered her toward the terrace doors. Come. You need air, and I need to explain some things before this goes any further. The terrace was less crowded, couples scattered along its length in discreet pools of shadow. Maximilian led Elena to the far end where marble balustrades overlooked the darkened gardens below. Why? Elena asked as soon as they were alone. Why did you lie for me? You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why risk your reputation for a stranger? Maximilian leaned against the balustrade, studying her face in the lamplight. Do you know what I saw when that butler exposed you? I saw a woman standing alone before a hostile crowd, terrified but refusing to break. I saw dignity in the face of humiliation. I saw authenticity in a room full of masks and pretense. And I thought, here, finally, is someone real. You don't know me, Elena repeated. I could be anyone. A fortune hunter, a confidence artist. Everything they suspect. Are you? No, but I am a fraud. Everything they said is true. I forged that invitation. I have no right to be here. Rights? Maximilian's laugh was bitter. Do you know what rights I have? I have the right to inherit an estate I didn't earn, the right to a title I was born into by sheer chance, the right to sit in Parliament and make laws affecting millions, based solely on my family name. Are those rights more legitimate than your forged invitation? At least you worked for yours. You planned, risked, reached for something beyond your station. I've never had to reach for anything in my life. Elena stared at him. You sound like you hate it. Your life. I don't hate it. I'm just profoundly tired of it. He turned to face the gardens. Every day is the same performance. Every person I meet wants something. My title, my wealth, my connections. Every marriage prospect is a calculated alliance designed to unite fortunes or settle debts or advance political interests. No one has ever looked at me and seen just me. Not the Duke, not the fortune, just a man. Is that why you helped me? Elena asked softly. Because I didn't know who you were? Partly. He looked at her again. But also because you reminded me that courage still exists in the world, that some people still take risks for what they believe in, even foolish, desperate risks. They stood in silence for a moment, the music drifting out from the ballroom behind them. Elena became acutely aware of how close they were standing, the way the lamplight caught in his dark hair, the warmth radiating from his body, in the cold December air. What happens now? She asked. Tomorrow, when people start asking questions, when they realize your story about the gardens doesn't quite hold together. Then we make sure it does hold together. Maximilian straightened, his expression shifting into something more decisive. I meant what I said, Elena. You're under my protection now. That means you'll need a proper introduction to society. Invitations to the right events, a respectable address, not whatever slum you're currently living in. Don't look offended. I can see your circumstances in your dress. It's beautiful, but it's 3 seasons old and altered to fit you. Elena flushed. I can't accept charity from you. It's not charity, it's patronage. You said you wanted to show your work to Lady Silverton? I can arrange much better than that. I can arrange for you to show your botanical illustrations to the Royal Society. I can commission pieces myself. I can introduce you to collectors who will pay handsomely for quality work. Why would you do all this? Maximilian smiled, and again she was struck by how it transformed him. Perhaps I'm bored, and you're entertaining. Perhaps I'm tired of meaningless conversations, and you promise to be interesting. Or perhaps... He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. Perhaps I'm curious to see what happens when someone with real talent is given a real chance. Elena's breath caught. His hand had dropped away, but she could still feel the ghost of his touch against her skin. This is madness, she whispered. Yes, he agreed, but it's the most alive I've felt in years. So what do you say, Miss Elena Thatcher? Shall we scandalize London together? Elena thought of Aunt Margaret, dying in their shabby rented room, of the rent she couldn't pay and the future she couldn't imagine, of the forged invitation that was supposed to be her salvation and instead had nearly been her destruction. And she thought of the Duke of Ashbourne, who'd saved her for reasons she still didn't fully understand, who was offering her a lifeline she'd never dared dream of. I'll need to tell my aunt, she said. She'll worry if I don't come home tonight. Then we'll send a message. My carriage will take you home later with a proper escort so there's no question of impropriety. But for now, he offered his arm again. For now, let's return to the ballroom and show them all that you're here to stay. They walked back inside together, and Elena felt the weight of 100 stares. But this time, with Maximilian beside her, they felt different. Not crushing, but exhilarating. Not the end of her story, but the beginning of something new. Lady Silverton approached as they reached the dance floor. The elderly woman studied Elena with sharp, intelligent eyes. Miss Thatcher, she said, His Grace tells me you're a botanical illustrator. Yes, my lady. Elena's voice steadied. I specialize in rare specimens, orchids primarily, but also exotic ferns and medicinal herbs. How fascinating. I'm organizing an exhibition at the British Museum next month. Works by emerging artists, particularly women. I'd be interested in seeing your portfolio. It was exactly what Elena had risked everything to achieve. She felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time from gratitude rather than fear. I would be honored, my lady. Excellent. Send your pieces to my secretary next week. Lady Silverton smiled warmly, then lowered her voice so only Elena and Maximilian could hear. I don't know what game you two are playing, but I do know courage when I see it. You have mine, child. Use it wisely. She swept away, leaving Elena breathless. You see, Maximilian murmured. Possibilities. The rest of the evening passed in a strange dream. Elena danced with several men, all deferential now that she bore the Duke's approval. She made conversation with women who, an hour ago, would have cut her dead. She ate delicacies she couldn't name and drank champagne that made her head spin pleasantly. And through it all, she was aware of Maximilian watching her. Not constantly, not obviously, but often enough that every time she looked up, she'd find his eyes on her. Sometimes with amusement, sometimes with something that looked like approval, sometimes with an intensity that made her skin warm. Finally, near 3 in the morning, he appeared at her side again. "My carriage is ready. I'll have it take you home." The crowd had thinned considerably. Only the most dedicated partygoers remained. Elena realized with a start that she'd spent nearly 4 hours in the Duke of Ashbourne's company, and it had felt like minutes. "Thank you," she said. "For everything. I know I've said it before, but I don't think you understand what you've done. You've saved my life tonight." "Thank you," he replied, "for making this evening memorable, for being brave when it would have been easier to run, for trusting me when you had every reason not to." They walked to the entrance together where his carriage waited, a beautiful vehicle with the ducal crest on its door. A footman held the door open. Before she climbed inside, Maximilian caught her hand. "I'll call on you tomorrow," he said, "to discuss the particulars of your introduction to society, and to see these botanical illustrations that have caused all this trouble." "My lodgings are not suitable for ducal visits," Elena said, acutely aware of the tiny, shabby room she shared with her aunt. "Then we'll meet somewhere neutral. The Botanic Gardens, perhaps? Where we allegedly first met?" His smile was gentle, conspiratorial. "Say, 2 o'clock? I'll be there." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in a gesture that was perfectly proper and yet felt shockingly intimate. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss Thatcher." Elena climbed into the carriage, her hand still tingling from his kiss. As the vehicle pulled away from Silverton House, she looked back to see him standing on the steps, watching her leave. What had she done? What had they done? She'd gone to the ball hoping for a patron and instead had found, what? A champion? A friend? Something more dangerous than either? The carriage rattled through London's sleeping streets, and Elena leaned her head against the velvet cushions, trying to process everything that had happened. Hours ago, she'd been nobody. A penniless artist with a dying aunt and no future. Now she was under the protection of the Duke of Ashbourne, with invitations to royal exhibitions and promises of commissions. It was too much, too sudden, too perfect. And yet, as she remembered the way Maximilian had looked at her, the way he'd spoken to her as if she mattered, as if her thoughts and dreams were worth listening to, she couldn't make herself regret it. The carriage stopped outside her lodging house, a narrow building in an unfashionable part of town. The footman helped her down, and Elena noticed him trying not to show his reaction to the neighborhood. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Please tell His Grace I arrived safely." She climbed the narrow stairs to her room, trying to be quiet so as not to wake the other tenants. Inside, a single candle guttered in its holder. Aunt Margaret lay in the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Elena changed out of the borrowed gown carefully, hanging it so it wouldn't wrinkle. Then she sat beside her aunt's bed, taking the old woman's hand in hers. "I did something very foolish tonight, Auntie," she whispered, "or very brave. Perhaps both. And I think it's going to change everything." Outside, church bells began to toll the hour. Dawn was coming, and with it, a new day, a new life. Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to hope. Elena woke to the sound of newsboys shouting in the street below. Their voices carried through the thin walls of the lodging house, announcing the morning's scandal with gleeful vigor. "Duke of Ashbourne's mystery woman! Read all about it! Forgery at the Silverton Ball!" Her stomach dropped. She'd known this was coming, but the reality of it, her name, her disgrace, splashed across every breakfast table in London, made her mouth go dry with fear. Aunt Margaret stirred in the bed, her eyes fluttering open. The old woman looked more fragile than ever in the morning light, her skin nearly translucent against the yellowed pillowcase. "Elena?" Her voice was a papery whisper. "What's all that shouting about?" Elena forced herself to smile. "Nothing important, Auntie. Just the usual morning noise. How are you feeling?" Like I'm dying, child. Because I am. Margaret's laugh dissolved into a cough that racked her thin frame. When it subsided, she fixed Elena with eyes that were still sharp despite her illness. Now tell me why the newsboys are screaming about the Duke of Ashbourne and why you came home at 4 in the morning wearing silk. There was no hiding it. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and told her aunt everything. The forged invitation, the exposure, Maximilian's intervention, the promise of patronage and protection. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Elena finished, silence filled the cramped room. Then Margaret reached out and gripped Elena's hand with surprising strength. "You foolish, brave girl," she said. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've saved us," Elena said, though her voice wavered. "Lady Silverton wants to see my work. The Duke himself promised to introduce me to collectors. We'll have money, Auntie, real money. You can see proper doctors, have proper medicine. And what will it cost you?" Margaret's eyes searched Elena's face. "These people, this world you've stumbled into, they don't give anything away for free, especially not to girls like us. The Duke may seem kind now, but what will he expect in return?" "He's not like that," Elena protested. "He was genuinely trying to help." "Men like him don't help girls like you without expecting something, Elena, whether it's your virtue, your gratitude, or simply your complete dependence on his charity. There's always a price." Margaret coughed again, harder this time. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't lose yourself in pursuit of something that was never meant for us." Elena wanted to argue, but a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. She opened it to find her landlady, Mrs. Blackwood, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and her face set in hard lines. "Miss Thatcher, a word, if you please." Elena stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her to spare her aunt the conversation she knew was coming. "I run a respectable house," Mrs. Blackwood said without preamble. "I don't tolerate scandal or impropriety. The other tenants are already talking. Some are saying you're a criminal, others worse things. It reflects poorly on my establishment." "I understand," Elena said quietly. "But I haven't done anything wrong. Not really." "You forged an invitation to infiltrate high society. It's in all the papers. That's the very definition of doing something wrong." Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry, miss. I know you've been a good tenant, always paid on time, quiet and respectful. But I can't have this kind of attention. I'm giving you 1 week to find other lodgings." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. 1 week? But my aunt, she can't be moved. She's too ill." 1 week, Mrs. Blackwood repeated firmly. "I'm sorry, but that's final." She turned and descended the stairs, leaving Elena standing alone in the dim hallway, the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. When she returned to the room, Margaret took one look at her face and understood. "How long?" "A week?" "Then you'll go to your Duke," Margaret said. "Today. And you'll accept whatever help he offers, because pride is a luxury we can no longer afford." Elena changed into her best day dress, a simple gray wool that was respectable if not fashionable, and gathered her portfolio of botanical illustrations. Her hands shook as she selected the best pieces, watercolors that had taken her months to complete. Each one represented hours of work at the Botanic Gardens, sketching specimens in the cold, early morning hours before the crowds arrived. The morning newspapers were even worse than she'd feared. The Times had devoted half a column to the scandal, describing her as a woman of uncertain origins and questionable character who gained entrance to one of London's most exclusive events through documented fraud. The Morning Chronicle was more sensational, speculating wildly about her relationship with the Duke and suggesting all manner of impropriety. One paper had even printed a crude illustration of her standing in the ballroom, surrounded by pointing fingers and scandalized faces. The artist had given her features that were harder, older, more calculating than her own. She looked like exactly what they believed her to be, a scheming fortune hunter. Sarah arrived just before noon, breathless from running up the stairs. "I came as soon as I could," she panted. "Elena, the whole city is talking about you. My mistress was reading about it at breakfast, and the things she said—" Sarah's face twisted with anger and sympathy. "They're calling you terrible names. A confidence artist, a social climber. Worse things I won't repeat." It's fine, Elena lied. The Duke promised to help. I'm meeting him at the Botanic Gardens at 2 o'clock. And you trust him? Sarah asked. Elena, be realistic. Men like him don't marry girls like us. At best, he'll make you his mistress and discard you when he tires of you. At worst, she stopped, but the implication hung heavy in the air. I know the risks, Elena said. But what choice do I have? Mrs. Blackwood is evicting us. Aunt Margaret has a week to live, maybe 2. Without the Duke's patronage, I have nothing, less than nothing. Sarah pulled her into a fierce embrace. Then be smart. Be careful. And remember that you're worth more than whatever crumbs he throws you. The walk to the Botanic Gardens took 30 minutes through streets that suddenly felt hostile. Elena imagined everyone staring at her, recognizing her from the newspaper descriptions. A group of well-dressed women actually crossed the street to avoid her, their whispers carrying back on the cold wind. The gardens were nearly empty at this hour, most of London's fashionable set still at home digesting their scandalous breakfast reading. Elena found a bench near the orchid house and waited, her portfolio clutched in her lap like a shield. Maximilian arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, dressed in a dark coat and carrying a walking stick. He looked every inch the Duke, composed, confident, untouchable. When he saw her, though, his expression softened into something warmer. Miss Thatcher, thank you for meeting me. Your Grace. Elena stood, suddenly uncertain how to behave. Yesterday's easy conversation felt impossible in the harsh light of day and scandal. Maximilian, he corrected gently, at least when we're alone. May I? He gestured to the bench, and they sat together, maintaining a careful distance. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Maximilian sighed and pulled a newspaper from his coat pocket. I suppose you've seen these. All of them, Elena confirmed. They're quite creative in their condemnation. They're vicious and cruel, and half of what they've printed is outright fabrication. His jaw tightened. I've already sent letters to the editors demanding retractions and corrections. Not that it will do much good. The damage is done. I've been evicted from my lodgings, Elena said bluntly. My landlady gave me 1 week. My aunt is too ill to be moved easily, but we have nowhere else to go. So you see, Your Grace, Maximilian, the damage is considerably worse than bad press. His face went very still. I hadn't considered that. I should have, but I didn't. That was thoughtless of me. You're not responsible for the consequences of helping me, aren't I? He turned to face her fully. Elena, I made you a promise last night. Protection, patronage, introduction to society. But protection means more than just standing beside you at a ball. It means providing real, practical support, a place to live, medical care for your aunt, safety from those who would use the scandal to destroy you. I can't accept all that, Elena protested. It's too much. People would say... She stopped, but they both knew what people would say. People are already saying it, Maximilian said flatly. Every gossip in London is convinced you're my mistress, or my secret wife, or some elaborate con artist. We can't stop them talking, but we can control the narrative. Give them a story they can accept. What story? He stood and began to pace, his mind clearly working through possibilities. The truth, mostly. You're a talented artist. I discovered you at the gardens last spring while you were sketching. I was impressed by your work and decided to become your patron. The forged invitation was an unfortunate misunderstanding. You believed I'd sent it, but there was a miscommunication with my secretary. Everything I said last night was essentially true, just arranged to fit a more acceptable timeline. And my living situation? I own several properties in London. One is a townhouse in Bloomsbury, currently empty. It's modest by aristocratic standards, but far superior to your current lodgings. You and your aunt will move there. I'll provide a housekeeper, a cook, and a nurse for your aunt. In return, you'll produce botanical illustrations for my personal collection. A professional arrangement, properly documented and legally binding. It sounded perfect. Too perfect. Elena studied his face, looking for the trap, the hidden cost. Why? She asked. Don't tell me you're bored or that I'm interesting. Tell me the real reason you're doing this. What do you want from me? Maximilian stopped pacing. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he sat beside her again, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. "I want," he said slowly, "to see what happens when talent is given opportunity. I want to prove that birth and breeding matter less than skill and determination. I want to watch the very people who condemned you last night trip over themselves to praise you 6 months from now." He paused. "And yes, I want your company, your perspective, your honesty. Because you're the first person in years who doesn't want something from me. You didn't even know who I was when this started." "I know now," Elena pointed out, "and I very much want something from you. I want survival, safety, a chance at the life I've always dreamed of." "Then we both want something. That makes us honest, at least." He smiled slightly. "So what do you say? Will you accept my offer? Professional patronage, proper lodgings, medical care for your aunt, all documented and legitimate?" Elena looked down at her portfolio. Inside were the best pieces she'd ever created, each one a small masterpiece of scientific accuracy and artistic beauty. She thought of Aunt Margaret, dying in a cold room because they couldn't afford fuel for the fire. Of the week they had before being thrown into the street. Of the future that had seemed so impossible yesterday and now gleamed before her like a distant star. "I'll accept," she said. "On one condition. I want everything in writing. The terms of my employment, the living arrangements, everything. I won't be dependent on verbal promises or casual charity." "Agreed." Maximilian extended his hand. "Shall we seal it properly?" Elena shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, the warmth of his skin. It felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that someone would catch her before she hit the ground. "Now," he said, releasing her hand, "show me these illustrations that have caused so much trouble." Elena opened her portfolio with trembling fingers. The first piece was an orchid, a rare specimen she'd found in the hothouse, deep purple petals, shading to white at the center, each vein and marking captured in minute detail. She'd spent 3 days on it, working until her eyes burned and her hand cramped. Maximilian studied it in silence. Then the next piece, a delicate fern with impossibly intricate fronds. Then another, and another. He said nothing, his face unreadable, and Elena felt her anxiety building with each passing second. Finally, he looked up at her. "These are extraordinary." "Thank you, but no, you don't understand. These aren't just good. They're museum quality. Scientific institutions would pay handsomely for this level of accuracy and artistry." He held up the orchid painting. "This should be in the Royal Society's collection. They should all be. Elena, you're not just talented, you're brilliant." The words hit her like a physical force. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. With such certainty, such conviction in her worth. Her voice caught. "Thank you. Don't thank me. You did the work. I'm just finally seeing it properly recognized." He carefully returned the illustrations to her portfolio. "We'll need to organize a proper showing, not Lady Silverton's exhibition. That's too small. Something at the Royal Academy or the British Museum. Somewhere that will establish you as a serious artist, not a curiosity or a scandal." "That will take months to arrange," Elena said. "And money. Exhibition fees, framing, promotion, all of which I'll provide. Consider it an investment in my collection." His eyes gleamed with something that looked like excitement. "We'll do this properly, Elena. We'll show London that you're not a fraud or a fortune hunter. You're an artist of genuine merit who deserves recognition regardless of your birth or circumstances." It was everything she'd wanted, more than everything. And yet, sitting there in the cold December air with this enigmatic Duke who'd turned her life upside down, Elena felt a creeping sense of unease. This was all happening too fast, too easily. Nothing in her life had ever come without a cost. "When can you move into the Bloomsbury house?" Maximilian asked. "As soon as it's ready. My aunt shouldn't be moved at night, but during the day, with a proper carriage and someone to help, I'll send my personal physician to examine her first, make sure the journey won't be too taxing. The house will be ready by tomorrow evening. I'll have it properly staffed and supplied. You and your aunt will want for nothing." "Maximilian," Elena turned to face him directly. "This is too much. Too generous. I can't possibly repay. I don't want repayment. I want your art. I want your success." And perhaps, he hesitated, something vulnerable crossing his face. Perhaps I want to prove to myself that I can do something meaningful with my absurd privilege, that I can help someone who actually deserves it rather than watching from the sidelines while talent withers for lack of opportunity. Before Elena could respond, a woman's voice cut through the quiet garden air. Well, well, how touching. They both turned to find Lady Arabella Thornfield standing on the path, flanked by two other women Elena didn't recognize. All three wore expressions of malicious satisfaction. "Lady Arabella," Maximilian said, his tone going cold. "What an unexpected intrusion." "Intrusion? This is a public garden, Your Grace. Surely you don't expect privacy when conducting your affairs in broad daylight." Arabella's eyes raked over Elena with unconcealed contempt. "Or is it only privacy from the right sort of people that you require? I imagine this creature is accustomed to conducting her business in far less genteel surroundings." Elena's hands clenched in her lap, but before she could speak, Maximilian was on his feet. "You will apologize to Miss Thatcher immediately." "I will do no such thing." Arabella stepped closer, her voice dropping to something venomous. "I know exactly what she is, Maximilian. We all do. A common fortune hunter who forged her way into decent society and somehow managed to seduce you with her sob story and her convenient poverty. How much is she costing you? The house in Bloomsbury, yes, I know about that, your staff talks. The medical care, the promises of patronage. What a generous payment for her favors." "That's enough." Maximilian's voice could have cut glass. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Arabella laughed, the sound brittle and cruel. "I've known you for 10 years, Maximilian. I know exactly what you want, what you need. And it's not some grubby little artist with ink under her fingernails and delusions of adequacy. You need someone of your own class, someone who understands your world and can help you navigate it. Someone like me." The truth of her feelings, laid bare in the cold sunlight, made Elena's stomach turn. This woman didn't just dislike her, she hated her. Not for what Elena had done, but for what Elena represented. The possibility that Maximilian might choose substance over breeding, authenticity over aristocratic polish. "What I need," Maximilian said quietly, "is for you to leave. Now, before you say something you'll regret." "I regret nothing." Arabella turned her attention to Elena. "Enjoy it while it lasts, dear. Men like him don't marry girls like you. And when he tires of you, and he will, you'll find yourself right back in the gutter where you belong. Probably worse off than before, because now you'll know what you're missing." She swept away, her companions trailing behind her like malevolent shadows. The garden fell silent again, but the peace was shattered, the moment ruined. Elena stood on shaking legs. "She's right, you know, about some of it." "She's vicious and wrong about all of it," Maximilian countered. "No, she's right that this can't last, that eventually people like her will wear you down with their judgment and their expectations. That I don't belong in your world and never will, no matter how many houses you give me or exhibitions you arrange." Elena picked up her portfolio. "Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should have just accepted my exposure and left quietly." "Elena, I need to think." She stepped back when he reached for her. "Thank you for the offer, for everything, but I need time to decide if I can actually accept it. If the cost of your protection is worth the price, I'll pay in dignity and peace of mind." "The only thing I'm asking for is your art," Maximilian said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Not your virtue, not your soul, not your dependence, just your talent, properly compensated and professionally recognized." "And your companionship?" Elena challenged. "Your honesty, your perspective, your presence? Those aren't professional requirements, Maximilian. Those are personal. And people like Arabella will never see the distinction. To them, I'll always be your mistress, no matter how many contracts we sign or how publicly platonic our relationship remains." He had no answer for that, because they both knew it was true. Elena turned to leave, but Maximilian caught her arm, gently, not restraining, just enough to make her pause. "1 week," he said. "You have 1 week before your landlady evicts you. If you haven't found another solution by then, the Bloomsbury house will be ready. Your aunt will have the care she needs. And you'll have time and space to work on your art without worrying about rent or food or fuel. That offer stands regardless of what you decide about the rest of it." Why? Elena asked again, desperate to understand. Why do you care so much? Maximilian released her arm. Because I remember what it's like to feel powerless. My title, my wealth. They came to me by accident of birth. I didn't earn them, but I can choose what I do with them. And right now I choose to help someone who actually deserves it. Someone brave enough to forge an invitation to change her life, even knowing the risk. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the title and the privilege to the man beneath. A man who was lonely, who was tired of his gilded cage, who saw in her the same thing she saw in him, a chance at something real. 1 week, she agreed softly. I'll give you my answer then. She walked away through the gardens, her mind churning with impossible choices. Behind her, she heard Maximilian's footsteps fade in the opposite direction, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her fears and the weight of a decision that could define the rest of her life. The next 3 days were a special kind of torment. Elena tried to continue her normal routine, visiting the gardens to sketch, caring for Aunt Margaret, searching half-heartedly for new lodgings she knew they couldn't afford. But everywhere she went, she felt the weight of society's judgment. The greengrocer, who'd always been friendly, now barely acknowledged her. Her usual spot at the gardens was suddenly reserved when she tried to set up her easel. 2 potential landlords, upon hearing her name, suddenly had no vacancies. The newspapers continued their feeding frenzy. New stories appeared daily, each more outrageous than the last. One claimed she was actually an actress from a scandalous theater company. Another suggested she was a French spy using seduction to infiltrate the British aristocracy. A third, most bizarrely, claimed she was the secret daughter of a deposed European royal family. Sarah visited daily, bringing food and gossip and moral support. The whole thing is mad, she said on the 3rd day, sitting on Elena's bed while Margaret slept fitfully. They've made you into a villain in a penny dreadful. Next, they'll say you're a witch or a vampire. I wish they would, Elena said tiredly. At least that would be interesting. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Elena opened it to find a stern-faced man in expensive clothes holding an official-looking document. Miss Elena Thatcher? Yes? I'm Mr. Pemberton, the Duke of Ashbourne's solicitor. His Grace has asked me to deliver this contract for your review. It outlines the terms of your employment as a botanical illustrator in his service, including compensation, living arrangements, and professional expectations. He handed her the document, thick, expensive paper covered in dense legal text. You should have your own solicitor review it before signing, of course. His Grace has also instructed me to inform you that the Bloomsbury house is ready whenever you choose to occupy it. The staff has been hired and the rooms prepared. A physician will be available to attend your aunt at your convenience. Elena stared at the contract, her hands trembling. Tell His Grace, tell him thank you. I'll review this carefully and provide my answer within the week. Pemberton bowed slightly and departed, leaving Elena holding the physical proof of Maximilian's offer. She sat down and began reading. The terms were incredibly generous. An annual salary of £200, more than many skilled professionals earned. Full room and board in the Bloomsbury house, which the contract described in detail. 12 rooms, modern plumbing, a conservatory perfect for working. Medical care for any members of her household. A professional budget for art supplies and research trips. Copyright protection for her work, with her name prominently credited. And buried in the middle, a clause that made her breath catch. The artist retains full independence and may terminate this agreement at any time with 30 days' notice. The patron makes no claims on the artist's person, reputation, or future endeavors beyond the scope of botanical illustration. This is a professional arrangement between equals, governed by mutual respect and creative collaboration. It was everything she'd asked for, everything she needed, and it was real, documented, legally binding. That night, Aunt Margaret woke from a fitful sleep and found Elena sitting by the window, staring at the contract by candlelight. You're going to accept it, aren't you? Margaret's voice was weak but certain. I don't know, Elena admitted. The contract is perfect. Too perfect. But it doesn't change what people will think, what they'll say. People will always talk, child. The question is, can you live with their talk? Or will it eat away at you until you become as small and bitter as they want you to be? Elena turned to face her aunt. How do you do it? How do you live with dignity when the whole world thinks you're less than nothing? Margaret smiled sadly. You remember that their opinion doesn't change who you are. You're talented, Elena. Brilliant, even. I've watched you create beauty from nothing, turn simple plants into art that makes people stop and stare. That's real. Their gossip isn't. The question is, which truth will you choose to believe? The next morning, Elena woke to find her aunt burning with fever. She sent for a doctor, the cheap one they could barely afford, who examined Margaret with practiced indifference. Pneumonia, he pronounced. On top of everything else, she needs hospital care, proper medicine, constant attention. How much? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. More than you can afford, miss. I'm sorry, but without proper treatment, she has days, maybe a week. After he left, Elena sat beside her aunt's bed and made her decision. Pride was a luxury. Dignity was meaningless if Margaret died because Elena was too stubborn to accept help. She sent a message to Maximilian. I accept. Please send the carriage today. My aunt needs the physician immediately. The response came within the hour. Maximilian's personal physician, Dr. Harrison, a kind-eyed man with gentle hands, arrived with 2 assistants and a specially equipped carriage. They examined Margaret thoroughly, administered medicine, and carefully transferred her to the carriage with a level of care Elena had never seen given to anyone like them. She'll be comfortable at the Bloomsbury house, Dr. Harrison assured Elena. We've prepared a room on the ground floor, warm and quiet. The infection is serious, but with proper treatment and rest, she has a fighting chance. The Bloomsbury house was beautiful. Nothing like the grand mansions of Mayfair, but spacious and comfortable and so far above Elena's previous lodgings that it felt like entering a different world. The staff, a housekeeper named Mrs. Davies, a cook, a housemaid, and a nurse for Margaret, greeted them with professional courtesy that held no judgment. Margaret was installed in a sunny room with large windows overlooking a small garden. The nurse, a competent woman named Miss Porter, immediately began her care with an efficiency that spoke of real training and experience. Maximilian arrived that evening, finding Elena in what would be her studio, a conservatory filled with plants and natural light, with a large desk and every art supply she could imagine. "Does it suit?" he asked quietly. Elena turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. She's resting comfortably. For the first time in months, she's not in pain. Miss Porter says with proper care, she might have longer than we thought, maybe even improve somewhat. I'm glad. Maximilian stayed in the doorway, maintaining proper distance. The contract? I signed it. Mr. Pemberton has the executed copy. Elena wiped her eyes. I want you to know, this doesn't mean I'm not terrified, or that I've changed my mind about the cost of all this. But my aunt is dying, and I won't let pride kill her faster. Elena, no, let me finish. She took a breath. I'm going to accept your patronage. I'm going to live in this house and create art and try to build the career we discussed. But I won't pretend this is simple, or that people like Lady Arabella are wrong about everything. You've given me an extraordinary gift. I just hope neither of us comes to regret it. Maximilian crossed the room to stand before her. In the fading light, his face was half in shadow, impossible to read. I have one more gift, he said. Or perhaps it's a request. A ball. In 2 weeks. At my estate. A proper introduction to society as my official protégé. Lady Silverton will be there along with members of the Royal Academy and several prominent collectors. It's your chance to establish yourself as a serious artist rather than a scandal. Another ball, Elena said, because the last one went so well. This time, you'll arrive as an invited guest. No forgery, no deception, just talent, properly presented. His eyes searched hers. What do you say? Are you brave enough to face them again? Elena thought of Margaret, sleeping peacefully in a warm room with medical care she'd never have had otherwise. Of the studio waiting for her, filled with possibilities. Of the contract that protected her rights and recognized her worth. Of Maximilian, who'd saved her for reasons she still didn't fully understand, who was offering her a chance at everything she'd ever wanted. Yes, she said, I'll face them. And this time, I won't be the one looking away first. The 2 weeks before Maximilian's ball passed in a blur of preparations and growing dread. Elena threw herself into her work, creating new illustrations with a fierce intensity that bordered on obsession. Each morning she rose before dawn to sketch in the conservatory, the winter light filtering through the glass walls as her brush transformed blank paper into living art. Margaret improved slightly under Miss Porter's care, though they both knew it was temporary. The pneumonia had retreated, but the underlying consumption remained, patient and inevitable. "You're working too hard," Margaret observed one evening, watching Elena's ink-stained fingers tremble with exhaustion as she outlined the delicate structure of a rare fern. "I need to be perfect," Elena replied without looking up. "When I walk into that ballroom, my work has to speak so loudly that it drowns out every whisper, every accusation, every doubt. And if it doesn't?" Elena's hand stilled. "Then I'll have failed you, failed everyone who believed in me. The only person you'd fail is yourself, child. And that's only if you let their judgment become your truth." But their judgment was everywhere. The newspapers had grown more vicious as the ball approached. Someone, Elena suspected Lady Arabella, had been feeding them information. They knew about the Bloomsbury house, about Dr. Harrison's visits, about the expensive art supplies that appeared at Elena's door. Each detail was twisted into evidence of impropriety. "Duke's kept woman lives in luxury while honest folks starve," read one headline. Another proclaimed, "Botanical artist or social parasite, the scandalous truth about Elena Thatcher." The worst came 3 days before the ball. Elena was returning from the apothecary with medicine for Margaret when she saw them. A crowd gathered outside the Bloomsbury house, perhaps 20 people, mostly women. They held signs with slogans written in angry, uneven letters. "Shame," read one. "Haw!" declared another. "False artist, true harlot," proclaimed a third. Elena's blood went cold. She approached the house from the side street, hoping to slip in through the servants' entrance, but someone spotted her. "There she is, the fraud herself!" The crowd surged forward. Elena ran, her heart hammering, but they were faster. Hands grabbed at her cloak, her hair. Someone spat at her feet. "You think you're better than us?" a woman shrieked, her face twisted with rage. "You think spreading your legs for a duke makes you a lady?" "I've done nothing wrong," Elena gasped, trying to pull free. "I'm an artist. I work for my living." "You're a whore in a fancy house." Another woman pushed forward, this one younger, her eyes burning with jealous fury. "My husband lost his position because his employer couldn't afford to keep him. But you forge your way into wealth while decent people suffer." The medicine bottle slipped from Elena's fingers, shattering on the cobblestones. Margaret's medicine, irreplaceable and expensive, spreading in a dark stain across the street. "Let her go!" Mrs. Davies appeared at the front door, flanked by 2 footmen. They pushed through the crowd, creating a protective barrier around Elena. "This is private property," Mrs. Davies announced, her voice sharp with authority. "Disperse immediately, or I'll summon the constables." The crowd fell back reluctantly, but their hatred lingered like smoke in the air. Elena stumbled into the house, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "Are you hurt?" Mrs. Davies examined her quickly, efficient and kind. "The medicine," Elena whispered. "I dropped Margaret's medicine." "I'll send John for more immediately." Mrs. Davies guided her to a chair. "Miss Thatcher, you should know this has been building for days. There were 3 people yesterday, 7 the day before. Someone is organizing them, feeding their anger. This wasn't spontaneous." Elena knew who. The question was what to do about it. That evening, Maximilian arrived to find Elena in the drawing room, staring at nothing. He took one look at her pale face, her trembling hands, and his expression went dangerous. "What happened?" She told him about the crowd, the accusations, the broken medicine bottle. As she spoke, she watched his face harden into something cold and furious. "Arabella," he said flatly, "this has her fingerprints all over it. She's been poisoning the newspapers against you, and now she's weaponized the mob." "Why?" Elena asked, though she knew the answer. "Because she wants you gone, and she wants me punished for choosing you over her." Maximilian began pacing, his usual composure cracking. "I'll speak to her. Make it clear that if she continues—" "No." Elena stood. "That will only make it worse. She'll say you're threatening her, that you've become irrational over me. It will feed every narrative she's been building. Then what do you suggest? Allow her to terrorize you with impunity? I suggest I face them. Elena's voice steadied as the idea took shape. At your ball, in front of everyone. Let them see my work, hear me speak, judge me on my actual merit instead of gossip and assumption. That's what we were planning. No, we were planning a polite introduction where I stand quietly while others speak for me. I'm saying I speak for myself, directly, boldly. Elena met his eyes. I'm saying I stop hiding behind your protection and prove I deserve to be there. Maximilian stared at her. That's exceptionally brave and exceptionally dangerous. If you fail, if they reject you, then I'll know I tried everything. Elena's jaw set. I'm tired of being afraid, Maximilian. Tired of letting people like Arabella control the narrative. You asked me once if I was brave enough to face them again. Well, I am, but on my terms this time. Something shifted in his expression, respect, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite name. Then we'll do it your way. But Elena, he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the worry in his eyes. There will be consequences. Whatever you say, whatever you do, some of them will never forgive you for existing outside your proper place. I know. She smiled without humor, but they'll never forgive me anyway. At least this way. I'll have tried. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Elena selected her best 15 illustrations and had them professionally framed. She wrote and rewrote a speech, practicing until the words felt natural rather than memorized. She chose her gown carefully, not the most expensive option, but one that reflected her own taste rather than someone else's standards. Deep forest green with minimal ornamentation, elegant without being ostentatious. Margaret insisted on helping despite her weakness, sitting in Elena's room while they planned strategy like generals before battle. Remember, Margaret said, they want you to apologize, to grovel, to confirm their belief that you're beneath them. Don't give them that satisfaction. What should I give them instead? The truth, your talent, your dignity. Margaret reached for Elena's hand. And if they can't accept it, that's their failure, not yours. The night before the ball, Elena couldn't sleep. She stood in the conservatory, surrounded by her plants and her work, and tried to imagine the next evening. Every scenario ended in disaster, laughter, rejection, humiliation worse than before. She was still standing there when Maximilian arrived just after midnight, led in by a worried Mrs. Davies. I saw your light, he said quietly. I was riding past and thought, are you all right? I'm terrified, Elena admitted. I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if my speech fails? What if they hate my work? What if I prove Arabella right about everything? Maximilian crossed to stand beside her, looking out at the darkened garden. Do you know what I thought when I first saw you at the Silverton Ball? Before I knew about the forged invitation, before any of this began? What? I thought you looked lost. Like you'd stumbled into a dream and couldn't find your way out. But then the butler exposed you, and something changed. You stopped looking lost and started looking defiant. Terrified, yes, but also determined. Like you'd decided that if you were going to fall, you'd fall forward. He turned to face her. That's when I knew I wanted to help you, not because you were pitiful or desperate, but because you were brave. Because in that moment of total exposure, you didn't break. You stood there and took it, and I could see you already planning your next move. My next move was accepting help from a stranger, Elena pointed out. Smart move. His smile was gentle. Elena, tomorrow night they're going to judge you. Some fairly, most unfairly. But here's what they won't be able to deny. You're there. Despite the scandal, despite the mob, despite every newspaper in London calling you a fraud, you'll stand in my ballroom and show them who you really are. That takes more courage than most of them will ever possess. What if it's not enough? Then we try something else, but I don't think it will come to that. He gestured to the illustrations arranged around the conservatory. I've been watching you work these past 2 weeks. The detail, the precision, the way you capture not just how a plant looks, but how it lives. That's not something you can fake or seduce your way into. That's pure talent, and talent always finds a way to be recognized. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that skill and determination could overcome prejudice and class hatred. But she'd seen the mob outside her house, felt their rage and resentment. Talent meant nothing to people who'd already decided what she was. "Stay," she said impulsively. "Not like, I just mean stay and talk. Help me think about something other than tomorrow." So they sat in the conservatory and talked about everything except the ball. Maximilian told her about his childhood, the weight of expectations placed on him from birth, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted his title rather than his company. Elena described her early memories of her parents before they died, the way her father had encouraged her drawing even when they could barely afford paper. Somewhere around 2 a.m, the conversation drifted into comfortable silence. Elena realized she'd relaxed for the first time in days, the knot of anxiety in her chest loosening slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me. Not the scandal or the opportunity or the inconvenience. Just me." Maximilian's expression softened. "Thank you for letting me." He left shortly after, but the warmth of the conversation lingered. Elena finally slept, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't dream of failure. The day of the ball arrived with deceptive calm. Elena woke early, checked on Margaret, who was sleeping peacefully, and spent the morning making final adjustments to her speech. Sarah arrived at noon with moral support and a bottle of wine. "Drink this," Sarah commanded. "Not too much, but enough to settle your nerves." "I need a clear head. You need to not faint from anxiety. Trust me, a glass won't hurt." They sat together in Elena's room while Mrs. Davies and the housemaid prepared her bath and laid out her gown. Sarah chattering about harmless gossip from her employer's house, trying to distract Elena from the coming ordeal. At 4 o'clock, Elena began dressing. The green gown fit perfectly, the color bringing out the warmth in her brown eyes. Sarah dressed her hair in a simple but elegant style, leaving a few curls loose to frame her face. "You look like a lady," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her work. "A real one. Not pretending, not imitating, just you, at your best." Elena studied herself in the mirror. Sarah was right. She didn't look like she was wearing a costume anymore. The woman in the reflection looked confident, composed, ready, if only she felt that way inside. Maximilian's carriage arrived at 6. He'd sent his own vehicle rather than a hired one, a statement of support that wouldn't be lost on anyone who saw her arrive. Elena kissed Margaret goodbye. The old woman was too weak to attend, but squeezed Elena's hand with surprising strength. "Make them see you," Margaret whispered. "Make them understand." The drive to Maximilian's estate took an hour through darkening streets. Elena watched London pass outside the carriage window, trying to memorize everything in case this was her last night moving through this world with any kind of freedom or hope. The Ashbourne estate rose out of the twilight like something from a fairy tale. All golden windows and classical columns, with carriages already lined up to discharge their glittering passengers. Elena's stomach lurched as their carriage joined the queue. A footman opened her door, and suddenly she was stepping onto the gravel drive, very aware of heads turning to watch. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. "That's her. The fraud. Bold as brass, showing her face here." Elena kept her chin high and walked toward the entrance. The massive doors stood open, light and music spilling out into the cold January night. She could see people inside, hundreds of them. London's elite gathered to witness either her triumph or her destruction. Maximilian appeared at the top of the steps, devastatingly handsome in black evening dress. He descended to meet her, offering his arm with a formality that was also a claim. "Ready?" he murmured. "No, but I'm here anyway." His hand covered hers briefly, warm and reassuring. Then they were walking inside together, into the entrance hall where conversation died as every eye turned to watch them. The ballroom was even more magnificent than Silverton House, a vast space with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow prisms across the polished floor. But Elena barely registered the grandeur. She was too focused on the faces watching her, the spectrum of reactions from curious to hostile to coldly disapproving. Lady Arabella stood near the far end, surrounded by her usual coterie. When she saw Elena, her smile was sharp as a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maximilian's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, commanding instant attention. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before we begin the formal festivities, I've arranged a special presentation. Miss Elena Thatcher, my newly commissioned botanical illustrator, will be sharing some of her recent work. I hope you'll give her your full attention. It wasn't a request. The crowd shifted, some moving closer out of genuine interest, others positioning themselves for optimal mockery. Elena saw Lady Silverton near the front, her expression neutral but attentive. Members of the Royal Academy stood together, their faces skeptical. Maximilian had arranged her framed illustrations on easels along one wall, each piece carefully lit to show the work to best advantage. Elena walked to stand beside them, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. This was it, the moment that would define everything. She began to speak, her voice quiet but steady. My name is Elena Thatcher. Most of you know me as the woman who forged an invitation to the Silverton Ball. That's true. I did forge that invitation, and I'm not going to stand here and claim it was a misunderstanding or minimize what I did. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. This wasn't the apologetic speech they'd expected. I forged that invitation because I was desperate, Elena continued. Because I'm a talented artist with no connections, no family name, no way to access the world where my work might be recognized and valued. I took a risk, knowing the consequences if I was caught. And I was caught, publicly, humiliatingly. She paused, meeting eyes throughout the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, others fascinated. But here's what you don't know. You don't know that I've been drawing since I was 6 years old, that I spent every spare penny on paper and pencils while other girls bought ribbons and sweets. You don't know that I taught myself scientific illustration by studying specimens in the public gardens, in all weather, at all hours, because I couldn't afford formal training. Elena gestured to the illustrations behind her. You don't know that each of these pieces represents weeks of work, hours of observation, of capturing not just what a plant looks like, but how it lives, how it grows, how it fits into the larger natural world. This orchid, she pointed to her finest piece. I studied it for 3 weeks. I documented every stage of its bloom, every variation in color and structure. That's not the work of a fraud or a social climber. That's the work of someone who loves what she does enough to sacrifice everything else for it. The room had gone completely silent. Even the musicians had stopped tuning their instruments. So, yes, I forged an invitation. And yes, I'm here tonight because the Duke of Ashbourne chose to protect me when he could have let me be destroyed. But I'm not here to apologize for wanting more than my birth allowed. I'm not here to grovel for your approval or pretend I belong to your world by right of blood. Elena's voice strengthened. I'm here to show you that talent doesn't care about class, that beauty and skill and dedication exist outside your exclusive circles. And I'm here to tell you that your judgment, whether you accept me or reject me, doesn't change the quality of my work or the validity of my dreams. She fell silent, her chest heaving with emotion. The crowd stared at her, shocked into stillness by her audacity. Then Lady Arabella began to clap, slow, mocking applause that echoed through the silent ballroom. "Bravo!" Arabella called out, her voice dripping with false admiration. "What a stirring performance! You almost had me believing you were the victim in this sad tale. Almost." She stepped forward, and the crowd parted to let her through. "But let's examine your story more carefully, shall we? You speak of sacrifice and dedication, but what have you truly sacrificed? You live in a house provided by the Duke. You eat food paid for by the Duke. You wear gowns and use art supplies all purchased with the Duke's money. That's not sacrifice. That's dependency dressed up as independence." Elena felt her face heat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "The Duke is my patron, yes, a formal, legal arrangement." "How convenient." Arabella's smile was venomous. "And this patronage, does it extend to your bedchamber as well? Or are we meant to believe that a man provides so generously for a woman without expecting certain considerations in return?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even for Arabella, this was exceptionally bold. Elena saw Maximilian start forward, his face dark with fury, but she caught his eye and shook her head slightly. This was her battle. "You're projecting," Elena said clearly. You assume I would trade my body for security because that's what you would do. What you're trying to do right now, in fact, trading insinuation and cruelty for social standing and the Duke's attention. Arabella's face flushed red. How dare you? How dare I speak the truth? How dare I refuse to be ashamed of accepting help when I needed it? Elena took a step toward Arabella, her fear transforming into righteous anger. You want me to grovel? To confirm that I'm beneath you? That I deserve your contempt? I won't do it, because the only thing separating us is that your father was born rich and mine wasn't. You didn't earn your place in this ballroom any more than I earned my poverty. We're both accidents of birth trying to make the best of what we were given. The crowd was murmuring now, shocked by Elena's boldness. No one spoke to Lady Arabella Thornfield like this. No one dared. The difference between us, Elena continued, her voice ringing clear, is that I'm trying to create something beautiful and meaningful with my life, while you're trying to destroy someone else's out of petty jealousy and wounded pride. So yes, judge me for my forged invitation, judge me for accepting patronage, but before you do, look at what I've created. She gestured to the illustrations. And ask yourself what you've contributed to the world besides cruelty and gossip. The silence that followed was absolute. Arabella stood frozen, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. No one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever called out her behavior so publicly and devastatingly. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Real applause this time, not mocking. Elena turned to see an elderly man with a Royal Academy pin on his lapel leading the applause. Others joined him, first a trickle, then more, until perhaps half the room was clapping. Not everyone. Many stood silent, their faces cold with disapproval. But enough. Enough to matter. Lady Silverton approached the illustrations, studying them closely with an expert's eye. These are extraordinary, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The detail, the accuracy, Miss Thatcher, you have genuine talent. I want to include all 15 pieces in my British Museum exhibition, with your name prominently featured, of course. The elderly man from the Royal Academy joined her. I'm Sir Edmund Price, Miss Thatcher. I oversee the Botanical Illustration Program at the Academy. I'd like to discuss a possible teaching position. We need instructors who combine scientific knowledge with artistic skill. Elena's head spun. A teaching position? At the Royal Academy? It was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. But Arabella wasn't finished. This is absurd, she spat. You're all falling for the most obvious manipulation. She's seduced the Duke, delivered a rehearsed speech designed to play on your sympathies, and now you're rewarding her fraud with positions and exhibitions? Have you all lost your minds? The only thing fraudulent here, came a new voice, is your claim to moral authority, Arabella. Everyone turned to see who'd spoken. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, tall, elegant, perhaps 50 years old. Elena didn't recognize her, but clearly everyone else did. The crowd drew back respectfully. Lady Catherine, Maximilian said, surprise evident in his voice. I didn't know you were in London. I arrived this morning specifically to attend your ball, nephew. The newspapers made it sound too interesting to miss. Lady Catherine's eyes swept the room before settling on Arabella with cold assessment. And I must say the reality exceeds even the gossip's promises. Nephew. This was Maximilian's aunt, Elena realized, a woman with enough social standing to speak with impunity. Lady Thornfield has been quite vocal about Miss Thatcher's supposed impropriety, Lady Catherine continued. How curious, given Arabella's own history. Tell me, Arabella, does Lord Thornfield know about your affair with his business partner? Or should we discuss it here, in front of everyone? The color drained from Arabella's face. That's a lie. Is it? I have letters. Very detailed, very passionate letters that somehow found their way into my possession. I'd be happy to read them aloud if you'd like to continue this discussion about who does and doesn't deserve social acceptance. Arabella looked like she might faint. The crowd was riveted, scandal eclipsing scandal in delicious succession. Here's what I propose, Lady Catherine said, her voice pleasant but implacable. You will apologize to Miss Thatcher. Now, publicly, and then you will leave this ball and cease your campaign against her. In return, I will keep your correspondence private. Refuse, and I'll ensure every drawing room in London knows exactly what kind of woman you really are." Elena watched Arabella war with herself, pride fighting survival. Finally, survival won. "I apologize," Arabella ground out, the words clearly painful. "Miss Thatcher, for my uncharitable assumptions." It was the worst apology Elena had ever heard, but Lady Catherine nodded as if satisfied. "Lovely. Now leave, please. I believe your carriage is waiting." Arabella fled, her supporters trailing behind her in confused disarray. The moment she was gone, the room erupted in excited conversation. Elena stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Lady Catherine approached her with a kind smile. "My dear girl, that was magnificently done. You have spine. I approve." "Thank you, my lady." "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just continue being exactly who you are. That seems to be working splendidly." She turned to Maximilian. "Nephew, I believe you've found yourself an exceptional protege. Don't mess it up." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People approached Elena constantly, some to examine her work, others to introduce themselves, a few to apologize for their earlier assumptions. Sir Edmund pressed her about the teaching position. Lady Silverton discussed exhibition plans. Collectors inquired about commissions. But through it all, Elena was aware of Maximilian watching her, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, more complicated. When the crowd finally thinned enough for them to speak privately, he drew her onto the terrace where they'd stood weeks ago at the Silverton Ball. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly. The speech, standing up to Arabella. "Elena, you've just changed everything." "Your aunt changed everything," Elena corrected. "I was about to be destroyed before she intervened." "No, you'd already won. Aunt Catherine just accelerated the inevitable." Maximilian stepped closer, his eyes intense. "Did you mean it? What you said about accidents of birth, about not apologizing for wanting more?" "Every word." "Good. Because there's something I need to tell you, and I don't want you to think it's pity or obligation or anything other than what it is." He took a breath, and Elena saw uncertainty flash across his face, the first time she'd ever seen him unsure. "I'm falling in love with you, Elena. I have been since that first night when you stood in front of that hostile crowd and refused to break. I know it's too soon. I know the circumstances are complicated, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just patronage or friendship or professional interest. It's more. You're more." Elena's breath caught. This was what she'd feared and hoped for in equal measure, the complication that would make everything impossibly difficult or impossibly wonderful. "Maximilian, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that what I feel for you has nothing to do with your art or your scandal or your gratitude. It's just you. The woman who forged an invitation because she was brave enough to reach for something better. The artist who sees beauty in plants that most people overlook. The person who makes me feel like I'm more than just a title and a fortune." Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his eyes. He meant it, every word. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me. Because loving you means risking everything, my independence, my hard-won respectability, my sense of who I am. If this goes wrong, then we face it together." Maximilian reached for her hand. "Elena, I'm not asking you to be my mistress or my dependent or anything other than my equal. I'm asking if you'll let me court you properly. Let me prove that what we have is real and worthy and strong enough to withstand whatever society throws at us." Before Elena could answer, a footman appeared at the terrace door, his face grave. "Your Grace, Miss Thatcher, there's an urgent message from the Bloomsbury house. Miss Porter sent it. It's about Miss Thatcher's aunt." Elena's heart stopped. She knew what was coming before the footman said another word. "She's taken a turn for the worse, miss. Miss Porter says you should come immediately." The carriage ride back to Bloomsbury was the longest hour of Elena's life. Maximilian sat across from her, his presence steady and silent, while she gripped the edge of the seat so hard her knuckles went white. The city rushed past in a blur of gaslight and shadow, and all Elena could think was that she'd spent the evening fighting for her reputation while Margaret fought for her life. "She'll be all right," Elena whispered, though she didn't believe it. She has to be all right. Maximilian said nothing. They both knew that hope and reality were often strangers. The house blazed with light when they arrived. Miss Porter met them at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like relief. "She's stable for now," the nurse said before Elena could ask. "But, Miss Thatcher, you need to prepare yourself. She's asking for you. And she's lucid. Very lucid. Like people sometimes get before—" She stopped, but Elena understood. Before the end. Elena took the stairs at a run, her ball gown tangling around her legs. Behind her, she heard Maximilian speaking quietly to Miss Porter, but the words didn't register. All that mattered was reaching Margaret. Her aunt lay propped on pillows, her face so pale it seemed to blend with the linens. But her eyes were bright and clear, more alert than they'd been in weeks. "There you are," Margaret said, her voice weak but steady. "Come here, child. Tell me about the ball." Elena sank onto the bed, taking her aunt's hand. "The ball doesn't matter. How are you feeling? What happened?" "I'm dying, Elena. That's what happened. It's been happening for months, and tonight it simply decided to accelerate." Margaret squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Don't cry. Not yet. First, tell me about the ball. Did you triumph or fail?" Through tears, Elena described the evening, her speech, the confrontation with Arabella, Lady Catherine's intervention, the offers from Sir Edmund and Lady Silverton. As she spoke, Margaret's face softened into satisfaction. "Good," the old woman said when Elena finished. "That's exactly as it should be. You stood up for yourself. You didn't apologize for existing. I'm so proud of you." "Auntie, listen to me now because I don't have much time and there's something you need to understand." Margaret's eyes were fierce despite her weakness. "I've watched you your whole life, Elena. Watched you sacrifice your childhood to care for me after your parents died. Watched you deny yourself every pleasure, every dream, so that we could survive. You've been so busy being responsible, being careful, being good, that you forgot how to want anything for yourself. That's not true. It is true. Until you forged that invitation. That was the first selfish thing you'd done in 20 years. And look what came of it. Look where you are now. Offers from the Royal Academy, exhibitions at the British Museum, the protection of a duke who clearly loves you." Margaret's smile was gentle. "Do you know what my greatest fear has been? Not dying. I've been ready to die for a long time. My fear was that you'd spend the rest of your life alone and small, never reaching for anything because you were too afraid of failing me." Elena's tears fell freely now. "I could never fail you. You could fail yourself, and that would break my heart worse than any disease." Margaret reached up to touch Elena's face. "So here's what I need you to do for me. I need you to live, Elena. Really live. Take risks. Make mistakes. Fall in love with that duke who looks at you like you're the only real thing in his world. Build a career that matters. Be selfish sometimes. Be foolish sometimes. Be happy. I don't know how to do that without you." "Yes, you do. You've already started." Margaret's breathing was becoming labored. "Promise me. Promise you won't shrink back into safety when I'm gone. Promise you'll keep being brave." "I promise," Elena whispered. "I promise, Auntie." Margaret smiled. "Good girl. Now tell me about this duke. Is he handsome?" Despite everything, Elena laughed. "Very." "Kind?" "When it matters, yes." "And he loves you? Truly loves you? Not just wants to possess you?" Elena thought of Maximilian's face on the terrace, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd confessed his feelings. "I think so. Yes." "Then don't let him go. Men like that, men who see past the surface to what's real. They're rarer than your orchids." Margaret's eyes were starting to drift closed. "Stay with me? I don't want to be alone." "I'm not going anywhere," Elena promised. She stayed through the night, holding Margaret's hand while the old woman's breathing grew shallower and more erratic. Maximilian remained downstairs, a quiet presence she was aware of without needing to see. Mrs. Davies brought tea that Elena didn't drink. Miss Porter checked vitals with professional efficiency tinged with genuine sorrow. Just before dawn, Margaret woke one last time. "Elena, I'm here. Don't mourn too long. I've had a good life, longer than I had any right to expect, and I got to see you bloom. That's enough." Her grip tightened. Be magnificent, child. Be everything I knew you could be. I will. I swear I will. Margaret smiled. Then her hand went slack, her breathing stopped, and she was gone. Elena sat in the sudden silence, still holding her aunt's hand, unable to process that the woman who'd raised her, protected her, loved her unconditionally for 20 years was simply no longer there. The grief was too large to fit inside her body. It pressed against her ribs, her throat, her skull, demanding release but finding no outlet large enough. She was still sitting there, frozen, when Maximilian appeared in the doorway. He took one look at her face and understood. Without a word, he crossed to the bed and gently extracted her from her vigil, pulling her into his arms. That's when Elena finally broke. She sobbed against his chest while he held her, one hand cradling her head, murmuring words she couldn't hear but felt nonetheless. He didn't tell her it would be all right, or that time would heal, or any of the useless platitudes people offered in the face of death. He just held her and let her grieve. The next few days passed in a haze of necessary tasks: funeral arrangements, death certificates, letters to distant relatives who'd never cared about Margaret in life but might show up to claim non-existent inheritance. Maximilian handled most of it, his staff executing his orders with quiet efficiency while Elena moved through the house like a ghost. The funeral was small. Elena had expected no one beyond herself, Maximilian, and the household staff. But when they arrived at the cemetery, she found Sarah waiting, along with Thomas from the print shop, several women from Margaret's old boarding house, and, most surprisingly, Lady Silverton. "Your aunt was an extraordinary woman," Lady Silverton said quietly. "I met her only once, years ago, but I remembered her. She had dignity, real dignity, not the borrowed kind that comes with money. I wanted to pay my respects." After the service, as they stood beside the fresh grave, Maximilian spoke for the first time that day. "What do you need?" Elena looked at him, this duke who'd somehow become essential to her survival. "I don't know. Everything feels hollow. The ball, the commissions, the teaching position. It all mattered so much a few days ago, and now it feels meaningless. Grief does that. It makes everything else seem small." He took her hand. "But your aunt was right, Elena. She wouldn't want you to stop living because she's gone." "I know. But knowing and feeling are different things. Then feel what you need to feel. Mourn as long as you need to mourn. I'm not going anywhere." 2 weeks passed before Elena could bring herself to return to her work. She spent most of that time in her room, surrounded by Margaret's few possessions: a worn prayer book, a locket with pictures of Elena's parents, a shawl she'd knitted years ago. Small things that represented a life lived quietly, but with purpose. The newspapers, surprisingly, had gone quiet. Perhaps even London's gossips recognized that hounding a woman in fresh mourning was a step too far. Or perhaps, Elena thought cynically, they'd simply found newer scandals to dissect. She was sitting in the conservatory, staring at a blank page she couldn't bring herself to fill, when Mrs. Davies announced a visitor. "Sir Edmund Price, miss, from the Royal Academy. He says he wrote to you about an appointment, but you haven't responded." Elena's stomach sank. The teaching position. She'd forgotten completely. "Show him in, please." Sir Edmund entered with the air of a man who spent his life among books and specimens. He took one look at Elena's face, and his expression softened. "Miss Thatcher, please accept my condolences on your loss. I should have waited longer before calling, but there are matters of some urgency that require your attention." "I understand. You need an answer about the teaching position." Elena folded her hands in her lap. "I'm afraid I can't. That is, I'm not ready to. Actually, I'm not here about the teaching position." "Well, not primarily." Sir Edmund pulled an envelope from his coat. "I'm here because the Royal Society has voted to admit you as a corresponding member based on the quality of your botanical illustrations. It's unprecedented for someone without formal training or academic credentials, but your work speaks for itself." Elena stared at him. The Royal Society. One of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. "I don't understand. I haven't submitted anything to them." "The Duke of Ashbourne submitted 15 pieces on your behalf, along with detailed documentation of your methods and observations. The committee was, well, impressed doesn't begin to cover it. They'd like to commission a comprehensive botanical survey of rare orchid species. It would take approximately 18 months and require extensive fieldwork. The compensation would be substantial, and you'd retain full copyright to all illustrations. It was everything Elena had dreamed of. A year ago, she would have wept with joy. Now she felt only numbness. Sir Edmund, I'm honored, truly, but I need time to consider. Of course, there's no rush. He stood to leave, then paused. Miss Thatcher, may I speak frankly? Please. I lost my wife 3 years ago to consumption, the same disease that took your aunt. For months after, I couldn't work, couldn't think, couldn't see the point of anything. But eventually I realized that the best way to honor her memory was to continue doing what she'd always supported, my research, my teaching. She'd have been furious if I'd given it all up to sit in a dark room mourning. He smiled gently. Your aunt raised you to be an artist, to be brave. The greatest tribute you could pay her is to be exactly that, to take this opportunity and make something extraordinary of it. That's what she'd want. After he left, Elena sat in the conservatory for a long time, thinking about Margaret's last words. Be magnificent. Be everything I knew you could be. She picked up her brush. The first strokes were clumsy, unpracticed after 2 weeks of inactivity, but slowly the familiar rhythm returned. She was working on a new orchid specimen, a rare variety that Maximilian had procured from a collector, when she heard footsteps behind her. You're working again, Maximilian said quietly. That's good. Elena didn't turn around. Sir Edmund visited. The Royal Society wants to commission me for an 18-month survey project. I know, I submitted your portfolio to them. Without asking me? Would you have done it yourself? Elena finally looked at him. Probably not. I would have thought I wasn't ready, or that they'd reject me, or found some other reason to talk myself out of trying. Exactly. Maximilian moved to stand beside her, studying her in-progress illustration. You have a habit of underestimating yourself. It's one of the few things about you that frustrates me. There are others? Your tendency to shoulder every burden alone. Your refusal to ask for help even when you desperately need it. Your absolute conviction that accepting support somehow diminishes your achievements. He turned to face her fully. Elena, I want to marry you. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their directness. Elena's brush clattered onto the desk. What? I want to marry you, Maximilian repeated calmly. Not because I feel obligated or because society expects it after everything that's happened. I want to marry you because I love you, because you make me want to be more than just a title and a fortune, because when I imagine my future, you're the only person I want in it. Maximilian, I just lost my aunt. I'm in mourning. This isn't the time. I know. That's why I'm not asking you to answer now. I'm just telling you my intention so you can stop worrying about what happens next between us. He took her hand. Take the Royal Society Commission. Spend 18 months doing work you love. Build the career your aunt wanted for you. And when you're ready, when you've proven to yourself that you can succeed on your own merit, we'll revisit this conversation. And if I decide I don't want to marry you, then I'll respect that decision and continue being your patron, your friend, whatever you need me to be. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. But Elena, I'm going to spend the next 18 months proving to you that marrying me wouldn't diminish you, that we could be partners, equals in every way that matters, that you can have both a career and a marriage without sacrificing either. Elena looked at their joined hands, thinking about everything that had happened since that night at the Silverton Ball. How this man had saved her, supported her, loved her without demanding she become something other than herself. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, how to grieve and work and plan a future all at the same time. It feels like too much. Then don't do it all at once. Just do the next thing. Then the thing after that. Maximilian lifted her hand to his lips. What's the next thing, Elena? She looked at the unfinished orchid on her desk. Finish this illustration, then write to Sir Edmund accepting the commission. Perfect. And after that? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. That's all anyone can do. Over the following weeks, Elena slowly rebuilt her life. She accepted the Royal Society Commission and began planning the extensive fieldwork it would require. Lady Silverton finalized arrangements for the British Museum exhibition scheduled for early spring. The teaching position at the Royal Academy was postponed until after the survey project, but Sir Edmund made it clear the offer remained open. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, London's attitude toward her began to shift. The newspapers that had vilified her now ran respectful profiles of the talented young illustrator making waves in scientific circles. Invitations arrived from respectable hostesses who'd previously cut her dead. Women who'd crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to congratulate her on her Royal Society membership. The transformation was dizzying and deeply ironic. She was the same person who'd forged that invitation months ago, but now she had credentials, official recognition, the backing of prestigious institutions. Suddenly her birth no longer mattered. Her poverty was reframed as picturesque struggle. Even her relationship with Maximilian was viewed differently, no longer scandalous, but romantic, proof that true love transcended class boundaries. "It's infuriating, isn't it?" Sarah said one afternoon over tea. "They're celebrating you for the exact same things they condemned you for 3 months ago." "Completely infuriating," Elena agreed, "but also useful. I can't change their hypocrisy, but I can use their acceptance to build something real." The British Museum exhibition opened on a surprisingly warm day in March. Elena stood in the gallery, surrounded by her framed illustrations, and watched London's elite examine her work with genuine appreciation. The same people who'd watched her humiliation at the Silverton Ball now praised her technical skill, her artistic vision, her scientific accuracy. Lady Arabella attended, surprisingly. She approached Elena with a careful neutrality that suggested Lady Catherine's leverage still held. "Your work is impressive," Arabella said stiffly. "I can see why it's generated such interest." "Thank you, Lady Arabella." Elena kept her voice equally neutral. "I wanted to say—" Arabella hesitated, something like shame flickering across her face. "I behaved abominably toward you. Jealousy is an ugly thing, and I let it make me cruel. I'm sorry. Truly. It wasn't much, but it was something." Elena nodded acceptance, and Arabella moved away, the weight of her defeat visible in her rigid shoulders. Maximilian appeared at Elena's elbow, offering her a glass of champagne. "How does it feel, being the toast of London instead of its most notorious scandal?" "Surreal. Wrong, somehow, like I'm watching it happen to someone else. That will pass. Eventually you'll accept that you earned this. That talent and determination actually can overcome prejudice, at least sometimes." Elena sipped her champagne, watching the crowd. "Margaret should be here. She should see this." "She does see it." Maximilian's voice was gentle. "Wherever she is, she sees it. And she's proud." The exhibition was a massive success. Every piece sold within the first week, commanding prices that made Elena's head spin. Collectors commissioned new works. Scientific journals requested her illustrations for upcoming publications. The Royal Society accelerated her survey project timeline, eager to showcase her work. 2 months into the preparation for the survey, Elena received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the return address a solicitor's office in Edinburgh. Inside, she found a document that made her hands shake. She was still staring at it when Maximilian arrived for their scheduled dinner. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, seeing her face. "I have inheritance." Elena handed him the letter. "Apparently my mother had a small trust from her family. They were minor gentry in Scotland, and when she married my father, a poor artist, they disowned her. But there was money set aside held in trust until I turned 25, or until documentation of my mother's death was filed. Margaret must have filed the paperwork before she died, because the solicitors have been trying to reach me for weeks." Maximilian scanned the letter. "Elena, this is substantial. Not a fortune, but enough to provide real independence." "I know." Elena took the letter back, rereading it for the 10th time. "I could repay you. For the house, the medical care, everything." "Is that what you want to do?" Elena thought about it carefully. "No. I want to use it for the survey project, to fund my own field work, purchase my own equipment, retain full control over my research. And I want to establish a fund, a scholarship or grant program for other young women artists who don't have connections or resources, so they don't have to forge invitations to be seen. Maximilian smiled. That's perfect. That's exactly right. Is it strange that I feel guilty? Like accepting this inheritance somehow diminishes what I've built on my own? It's not strange at all, but Elena, he took her hands, this money doesn't change what you've accomplished. You built your reputation through talent and courage. The inheritance just gives you more tools to continue building. There's no shame in that. The scholarship fund became Elena's passion project alongside the survey work. She named it the Margaret Thatcher Fund for Emerging Women Artists, and the announcement generated surprising interest. Donations arrived from unexpected sources. Lady Catherine sent a generous sum. Lady Silverton contributed both money and connections. Even some of the women who'd initially condemned Elena sent modest contributions. You're changing things, Sarah observed, watching Elena sort through grant applications from hopeful young artists. Not just for yourself, for all of us. That's what Margaret would have wanted, for the door to be open for others, not just me. By summer, Elena was ready to begin the survey project. The work would take her across England and into parts of Scotland, documenting rare orchid species in their natural habitats. It was dangerous work, long hours in difficult terrain, exposure to elements, the constant risk of illness or injury. But it was also exactly what she'd always dreamed of doing. The night before her departure, Maximilian hosted a small dinner at his townhouse. Just Elena, Lady Catherine, Sir Edmund, and Lady Silverton, the people who'd become her unlikely support system. To Elena, Lady Catherine raised her glass, who proved that courage and talent matter more than birth, who took society's worst judgment and turned it into triumph, who refused to be diminished or destroyed. They drank to that, and Elena felt emotion tighten her throat. These people, these aristocrats and academics who should have been her natural enemies, had become her champions, not because she'd conformed to their expectations, but because she'd refused to. After dinner, Maximilian walked her to her carriage. 18 months, he said quietly. That's how long the survey will take. When you return, I'm going to ask you again to marry me. And this time, I hope you'll say yes. Elena looked at him, this impossible man who'd changed her life by choosing to see her as she truly was. Why are you so certain I'll agree? Because you love me. I see it in your eyes every time you look at me, in the way you lean into my touch without thinking about it, in how you trust me with your fears and your dreams. He cupped her face gently. You're just waiting to believe that you deserve this, that you can have both the career and the love without one destroying the other. And if I never believe it, then I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you. He kissed her forehead. Be safe out there, Elena. Come back to me. I will, she promised. The next morning, Elena departed London in a well-equipped carriage, her supplies and equipment secured, her itinerary carefully planned. As the city fell away behind her, she thought about everything that had changed since that night she'd forged an invitation in a desperate gamble for something more. She'd lost Margaret, the person who'd been her anchor for 20 years. But she'd gained a career, a reputation, a future full of possibilities. She'd faced society's worst judgment and emerged not just intact but victorious. She'd proven that talent and determination could overcome prejudice, that birth didn't define worth, that courage mattered more than connections. And she'd found love, complicated, challenging, extraordinary love, with a man who saw past her poverty and her scandal to the person beneath. The first stop on her survey was a remote valley in Yorkshire, where a rare species of lady's slipper orchid grew in the wild. Elena spent 3 weeks there, documenting every aspect of the plant's life cycle, creating illustrations that combined scientific precision with artistic beauty. When she returned to civilization, a letter was waiting from Maximilian. Inside was a newspaper clipping. The Times had run a full-page feature about her work, describing her as Britain's foremost botanical illustrator, and a credit to the advancement of women in scientific fields. His note was brief. They're starting to understand what I've known since the beginning. You're extraordinary. I miss you. Come home when you can. Elena folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her journal. Then she turned to her next destination, her next orchid, her next illustration. She had work to do, a legacy to build, a promise to keep to a woman who'd believed in her when no one else did. And when the work was done, when she'd proven everything she needed to prove, to society, to herself, she'd go home. To Maximilian. To the life they'd build together. To to the future that had seemed impossible but was now within reach. She was no longer the invisible woman who'd forged an invitation in desperation. She was Elena Thatcher, Royal Society member, acclaimed artist, woman of substance and achievement, and she was just getting started. 18 months of fieldwork changed Elena in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her hands grew calloused from climbing rocky hillsides to reach remote orchid colonies. Her skin darkened from long days working in open moorland. She learned to navigate by stars when fog obscured her path, to predict weather from the behavior of birds, to move through wild landscapes with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The work itself was transformative. Each orchid she documented felt like a small revelation. The intricate mechanisms that attracted specific pollinators, the symbiotic relationships with fungi in the soil, the delicate balance required for survival. She filled journal after journal with observations, created over 200 detailed illustrations, and amassed research that would reshape botanical understanding of Britain's native orchid species. But more than that, she learned who she was without anyone watching, without Maximilian's protection or society's judgment or Margaret's loving guidance. Just Elena, alone with her work and her thoughts, discovering that she was stronger and more capable than she'd ever imagined. Letters from London arrived sporadically, carried by postal riders to whatever remote village she'd made her temporary base. Maximilian wrote weekly, long letters full of news and observations and carefully casual mentions of how much he missed her. Sarah sent gossip and encouragement. Lady Silverton provided updates on the art world and the scholarship fund, which had already supported 6 young women artists. And every month, Sir Edmund wrote with news from the Royal Society. Her preliminary reports were generating significant interest. Several prominent scientists had requested permission to reference her work in their own publications. There was talk of a comprehensive book featuring her illustrations and research. Elena read each letter carefully, responded thoughtfully, but didn't allow herself to be pulled back into London's orbit. Not yet. She'd promised herself the full 18 months, and she intended to deliver. The final location on her survey was a series of limestone caves in the Scottish Highlands where a nearly extinct species of ghost orchid supposedly grew. The terrain was treacherous, the weather unpredictable, and local guides refused to take her, claiming the caves were cursed. "No good comes from those caves, miss," the innkeeper in the nearest village warned. "People go in and don't come out, or they come out changed, touched by something not natural." "I appreciate the warning," Elena said politely. "But I'm a scientist, not a superstitious fool. I'll be careful." She hired a young shepherd named Duncan, who knew the hills and wasn't afraid of old stories. Together they made the 2-day trek to the cave system, camping in the open despite October's creeping cold. The caves were magnificent, vast chambers decorated with stalactites and underground pools that reflected their lamplight like mirrors. And deep in the 3rd chamber, growing from a crack in the limestone where organic matter had accumulated over centuries, Elena found what she was looking for. The ghost orchid was aptly named. Its flowers were translucent white, almost luminous in the lamplight, with delicate spurs that curved like beckoning fingers. Elena had seen botanical illustrations of the species, but had believed it extinct in Britain. Finding a living colony felt like discovering treasure. She spent 3 days documenting the plants, working by lamplight in the cave's perpetual twilight. Duncan kept watch at the entrance, maintaining their camp and ensuring she had supplies. On the 3rd day, as Elena completed her final illustration, she heard voices echoing from deeper in the cave system. Men's voices, rough and urgent. Then a scream, high and terrified and definitely female. Elena grabbed her lamp and moved toward the sound, Duncan close behind her. They followed a narrow passage that opened into another chamber, this one smaller and dominated by a dark pool of water. 3 men stood around a young woman, barely more than a girl, really, who was tied to a rock formation. She was sobbing, her dress torn, her face bruised. One of the men held a knife. "Well now," the man with the knife said, turning to face Elena. "Looks like we've got company. You lost, lady?" Elena's mind raced. 3 armed men, 1 young shepherd, and a terrified captive. The odds were terrible, but she couldn't just walk away. "I'm Elena Thatcher, conducting research for the Royal Society," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Whatever you're doing here, it stops now. Release that girl immediately." The men laughed. "The Royal Society? That's supposed to scare us? We're miners, sweetheart. We found a rich vein of copper in this cave system. And we're not about to let anyone, not you, not her, not nobody, tell anyone about it. This whole area is supposed to be protected land, see? Can't mine it legal, so we do it quiet." "And she found out," Elena guessed, nodding toward the captive girl. "Got curious, started asking questions. Can't have that." The man with the knife stepped closer. "Now we got a problem. 4 people who know about our operation. Can't let any of you leave." Duncan moved to stand beside Elena. "There's 5 people now. My brothers know where I am. You touch any of us, they'll come looking, and they'll bring the constables." It was a bluff. Duncan had no brothers, but the miners didn't know that. They exchanged uncertain glances. Elena pressed the advantage. "You're already guilty of kidnapping and assault. Murder will see you hanged. But if you release the girl and leave now, I'll give you a head start before I report what I've seen. That's more mercy than you deserve." "You'll report us anyway," the leader snarled. "Yes, but I'll wait 24 hours. That's time enough to disappear if you're smart." Elena met his eyes without flinching. "Or you can kill us all and guarantee your execution. Your choice." The silence stretched out. Elena could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, the ragged breathing of the captive girl, her own heart hammering against her ribs. Finally, the leader lowered his knife. 24 hours? You have my word." The miners cut the girl free and fled into the depths of the cave system. Elena and Duncan waited until their footsteps faded completely before moving to help the girl, who was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "What's your name?" Elena asked gently, wrapping her own cloak around the girl's shoulders. "Moira. Moira Campbell. I work at the inn in the village. I saw them carrying equipment into the caves and thought they were treasure hunters. I followed them to see what they'd found, but they caught me." She began crying again. "They were going to kill me, throw me in the pool so no one would ever find my body." "You're safe now," Elena promised. "Duncan, can you get her back to the village?" "What about you?" "I need to finish documenting the orchids, and I need to mark the illegal mining operations location so the authorities can shut it down." She saw Duncan's protest forming and cut him off. "I'll be careful, but this work matters, and I'm not leaving it unfinished because of threats from criminals." It took another day to complete her documentation and map the mining operation. When Elena finally emerged from the caves, exhausted and filthy, she found a crowd waiting. Duncan, Moira, the village constable, and to her shock, Maximilian. He looked like he'd ridden hard for days. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his face shadowed with worry and lack of sleep. When he saw her, relief flooded his features. "Elena." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. "I've been searching for you for 2 weeks. You stopped writing, the postal writers said they couldn't find you, and I thought—" "I'm fine," she said, though she was starting to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. "I was in the caves. There was no way to send letters. Moira told us what happened, how you faced down armed men to save her, how you bargained for all your lives." Maximilian pulled back to look at her, his hands on her shoulders. "You could have been killed. But I wasn't, and now they've arrested the miners, shut down the illegal operation, and saved Moira. It worked out." "It worked out," he repeated incredulously. "Elena, you terrified me." "I'm sorry. But Maximilian, I found them. The ghost orchids, a whole colony, still alive. And I have complete documentation, better than anything that's ever been done before. This discovery alone will—" He kissed her. Right there in front of the constable and the villagers and everyone, he kissed her like a man who'd thought he'd lost something precious and just got it back. When he finally released her, Elena was breathless. "What was that for?" "For being you, for being brave and brilliant and absolutely impossible. For making me fall more in love with you every single day, even when you're hundreds of miles away risking your life in cursed caves." "They weren't cursed, just occupied by criminals." "Elena," Maximilian's voice was serious now. "I know you need to finish your work. I know you value your independence. But I couldn't stay in London one more day not knowing if you were safe. So I'm here, and I'm not leaving until you're ready to come home, even if that means following you to every remote corner of Britain while you document plants." Something in Elena's chest loosened. For 18 months, she'd been proving she could survive alone. But maybe the real strength wasn't in refusing help. It was in knowing when to accept it. "I'm done," she said. "The survey is complete. I was planning to return to London next week anyway." "Then we'll return together." The journey back to London took 5 days. Elena used the time to organize her research, compile her illustrations, and prepare her final report for the Royal Society. Maximilian rode beside her carriage for most of the journey, and in the evenings they stayed at country inns where Elena spread her work across tables and talked through her findings while he listened with genuine interest. "You've changed," he observed one evening, watching her sketch corrections to an illustration. "You're more confident, more certain of yourself." "I spent 18 months discovering I could survive on my own," Elena replied, "that I didn't need protection or patronage to do meaningful work. It's liberating." "Does that mean you don't need me anymore?" Elena looked up from her work, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't need you the way I did when we first met. I'm not desperate anymore. I have my own income, my own reputation, my own path forward." "I see. But," she continued, "I still want you. That's different. Stronger, maybe. I'm not choosing you because you can save me. I'm choosing you because you make my life richer, because you understand my work and support my ambitions, because you love me not despite my independence, but because of it." Maximilian smiled. "Is that a yes? To the proposal I haven't officially made yet. Ask me when we get to London, properly, and I'll give you a proper answer." They arrived in London on a grey November afternoon. The city looked the same but felt different, or perhaps Elena was the one who'd changed. She no longer felt intimidated by the grand houses or the well-dressed crowds. She belonged here now, not by birth, but by achievement. The Royal Society had organized a reception for her return. Elena walked into that same ballroom where she'd first been exposed as a fraud, but this time she entered as an honored member. Sir Edmund greeted her warmly, as did Lady Silverton and Lady Catherine. Even some of the people who'd condemned her before now lined up to congratulate her on her successful survey. "Miss Thatcher," Sir Edmund announced to the assembled crowd, "has completed the most comprehensive botanical survey of British orchid species ever undertaken. Her work will be published in a 3-volume set featuring over 200 original illustrations. It represents a landmark achievement in botanical science." The applause was genuine and sustained. Elena stood before them, not as a fraud or a scandal, but as a scientist and artist of recognized merit. She'd done exactly what Margaret had challenged her to do, proved that talent and courage mattered more than birth. After the formal presentations, Elena found herself surrounded by admirers and well-wishers. Young women asked her advice on pursuing careers in science. Collectors competed for commissions. Publishers offered lucrative book deals. Through it all, she was aware of Maximilian watching from across the room, his expression a mixture of pride and patience. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached her. "Walk with me." They slipped out onto the same terrace where they'd stood nearly 2 years before, when Elena had been a frightened fraud and Maximilian a bored aristocrat looking for meaning. "You asked me to walk with you the night of your ball," Elena said, "and I came even though I was terrified. You've always been brave, even when you didn't realize it. And you've always seen more in me than I saw in myself." Elena turned to face him. "So ask me what you've wanted to ask for 18 months. Maximilian took both her hands. "Elena Thatcher, will you marry me? Not because society expects it, not because it would be practical or advantageous, but because I love you with everything I am, because I want to spend my life supporting your work and sharing your triumphs, because you make me better than I ever thought I could be." "Yes," Elena said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you, on one condition. Anything. We're equals in this marriage. I keep my name professionally, I continue my work without restriction, and we use our combined influence to support other women trying to break through the barriers I faced. I wouldn't have it any other way." Maximilian pulled her close. "You never needed saving, Elena. You just needed someone to open the door, everything you've achieved since then. That's all you. We both know that's not true. Without your protection, you would have found another way. That's who you are. Someone who forges invitations when doors are locked. Someone who faces down armed men in caves, someone who refuses to accept that birth determines destiny. He kissed her gently. I didn't save you. I just had the privilege of watching you save yourself. The wedding took place in the spring, in the same chapel where Margaret was buried. It was smaller than a ducal wedding traditionally would be, just close friends and chosen family rather than the entire aristocracy. Sarah stood as Elena's attendant. Thomas gave her away in Margaret's absence. Lady Catherine and Lady Silverton sat in the front row, beaming with satisfaction at the match they'd helped create. Elena wore a gown of her own design, simple and elegant, with botanical embroidery that she'd worked herself, orchids winding up the sleeves and hem, each species she'd documented during the survey. It was unconventional, but then, so was everything about her path to this moment. As she walked down the aisle toward Maximilian, Elena thought about the terrified woman who'd forged an invitation nearly 2 years ago. That woman had been desperate and invisible, willing to risk everything for a chance at something more. She'd gotten so much more than she'd bargained for, not just a career and recognition, but love and partnership and the knowledge that she belonged in any room she chose to enter. The vows were traditional, but when Maximilian placed the ring on her finger, he added words of his own. I promise to support your independence, celebrate your achievements, and never ask you to be anything less than exactly who you are. I promise the same, Elena replied, and to remind you whenever you forget that titles don't define worth, that you're valued not for what you inherited, but for who you choose to be. The reception was held at the Ashbourne estate, in the same ballroom where Elena had made her defiant speech. But this time, the atmosphere was celebratory rather than hostile. The Margaret Thatcher Fund Scholarship recipients attended as honored guests, 7 young women who were already making their mark in various artistic fields. Moira Campbell came down from Scotland, fully recovered, and now working as an advocate for workers' rights. Sir Edmund gave a toast. To the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, may their marriage be as successful as their individual achievements, and may they continue to prove that love and talent recognize no boundaries. Later, as Elena and Maximilian danced, she saw Lady Arabella watching from the edge of the crowd. The older woman's expression was complex, regret perhaps, or acceptance. She caught Elena's eye and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of defeat that held no malice. Changed too, Maximilian murmured, following Elena's gaze. Lost her husband last year. Lost most of her fortune in bad investments. She's had to learn some of the same lessons you taught me, that privilege isn't permanent, that character matters more than status. I don't feel vindicated, Elena said, just sad for her. She could have been an ally instead of an enemy. That's what makes you different from her. You look for possibilities for cooperation where she only saw competition. The 3-volume botanical survey was published 6 months after the wedding, to widespread acclaim. Reviews praised both the scientific rigor and the artistic beauty of Elena's work. The books became standard references in botanical studies throughout Europe. Several of her orchid discoveries were named after her: Ophrys elenarum, Dactylorhiza thatcherae, her name now permanently embedded in scientific nomenclature. The teaching position at the Royal Academy proved equally successful. Elena's classes were always oversubscribed, young women fighting for spots to learn from the woman who'd broken through society's barriers. She taught them technical skills, yes, but also the courage to demand recognition, to refuse invisibility, to forge their own invitations when necessary. 2 years after the wedding, Elena stood in her conservatory at the Ashbourne estate, working on illustrations for a new project, a comprehensive guide to medicinal plants of the British Isles. Maximilian had commissioned it, but the work was entirely her own, her research and observations compiled over years of study. She was pregnant now, just beginning to show, and they'd agreed to slow her field work during the pregnancy. But not stop entirely. Elena had no intention of becoming a conventional duchess, defined solely by childbearing and social obligations. Mrs. Davies appeared at the conservatory door. Your Grace, you have a visitor, a young woman named Alice Harrison. She says she received a Margaret Thatcher Fund scholarship and has something to show you. Elena set down her brush and went to meet her visitor. Alice was perhaps 18, nervous but determined, clutching a portfolio. Your Grace, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to thank you in person. Alice opened her portfolio, revealing stunning watercolor portraits. The scholarship allowed me to study at the academy. I've just received my first major commission, portrait work for the Duchess of Marlborough's family. The paintings were exceptional, technically skilled but also emotionally resonant, capturing something essential in each subject's expression. These are wonderful, Elena said honestly. You have real talent, Alice. Because of you, I get to use it. Alice's eyes were bright with emotion. 3 years ago, I was working in a factory, drawing in stolen moments on scraps of paper. People told me to be realistic, to accept my place. But then I read about you in the newspapers, about how you'd forged an invitation and refused to apologize for wanting more. It gave me courage to apply for the scholarship, to believe I deserved a chance. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. You've earned everything you've achieved, Alice. Your talent did that, not me. You opened the door. That's what the scholarship means to all of us. It's not just money. It's someone saying we're worth investing in, that our dreams matter as much as anyone's. After Alice left, Elena returned to the conservatory to find Maximilian waiting. He'd been watching from the doorway, she realized. You've built something extraordinary, he said quietly. Not just a career, but a legacy. Women like Alice, women who would have been invisible and overlooked, they have chances now because of what you did. Because of what we did, Elena corrected. Your support made all of it possible. No, your courage made it possible. I just had the wisdom to recognize it. He drew her close, one hand settling gently on her growing belly. Our child will grow up in a different world than the one you were born into. One where talent matters more than birth. Where women can forge their own paths without being destroyed for it. You helped create that world, Elena. She leaned into his embrace, looking out at the conservatory full of plants she'd collected and studied, the workspace where she created art that mattered, the home she'd built with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. 2 years ago, she'd been a penniless artist forging an invitation in desperate hope of being seen. Tonight, she was a duchess, a renowned scientist, a teacher, a benefactor, and a woman who'd proven that the accident of birth mattered less than the content of character. Tell me something, Maximilian said. If you could go back to that night at the Silverton Ball, knowing everything that would happen, the scandal, the mob, Arabella's attacks, all of it, would you still forge that invitation? Elena thought about Margaret's death, the months of terror and uncertainty, the moments when she'd nearly broken under the weight of society's judgment. But she also thought about the work she'd accomplished, the women she'd helped, the love she'd found, the life she'd built from nothing but talent and audacity. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'd forge it again. Because sometimes the only way to change your life is to refuse to accept the doors that are closed to you. Sometimes you have to make your own invitation, even if the whole world calls you a fraud for trying. Outside, the sun was setting over London, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Elena watched the light shift and change, thinking about all the women who were watching that same sunset, dreaming of something more than their circumstances allowed. Some of them would be too afraid to try. Some would try and fail. But some would be brave enough to forge their own invitations, to demand recognition, to refuse invisibility. And when they did, Elena would be there, with scholarships and opportunities and the example of a woman who'd started with nothing and built everything. Because that was the true legacy Margaret had left her, not the instruction to survive, but the challenge to thrive, to be magnificent, to prove that worth wasn't inherited but earned, that dignity came from within, and that the greatest scandal was not in reaching too high, but in accepting that you were meant to stay low. Elena Thatcher, once invisible, once scorned, once called fraud and whore and worse, now stood in the light she'd created for herself. And in that light, she could see clearly all the way forward to a future where her daughter would never have to forge an invitation, because the doors would already be open. And if they weren't, well, Elena had taught the next generation exactly what to do about closed doors. You picked up a pen, created your own invitation, and walked in anyway. Bold, unafraid, and absolutely unwilling to apologize for daring to exist.